The real issues of this election are far, far vaster than the ones being contained in the launches and in the manifestos and in the broadcasts and the debates. And we really are on the edge of a major change in the way in which the country is governed and the sort of country it is, which isn't being discussed at all. And
How
it's quite
so,
likely.
Peter? Just without talking at too great a length, if that's okay. Just sort of bullet point for me. How are we on the precipice of an
Well,
unprecedented change?
the principal thing is that we have once again a seriously dogmatic Labour Party and a very seriously dogmatic leader with a good chance of becoming Prime Minister. This hasn't happened before since Alistair Campbell became Prime Minister with Blair as his glove puppet in 1997. I think it's clear that Reform doesn't have anybody else of anything remotely approaching his stature and appeal. So it's inevitably going to swing his way. He is, whether we like it or not, I don't particularly, one of the major figures of modern British politics. So it's not unreasonable to say, well, why should I spend several years of my life as a constituency MP sorting out people's drain problems? What I'm obviously here for is the main job. So I don't think anyone will mind that very much. I think what
I mind it.
Well, you shouldn't. There's no point in minding Nigel Farage. It's
Well,
like
it's a
being
bit of an insult, isn't it, to
offended by the
how our
weather.
system works? It's a bit of an insult to the constituents of Clacton, who might very much like Nigel Farage, but would also quite like him to be effective for them.
Well, maybe they would, but I'm sorry to say that I just don't think these things are really very likely to apply. And I would think that if the people of his intended constituency vote for him, they can't be really under very many illusions about what kind of person he is. He's been around a long time. This is, I think, his 8th attempt to get into Parliament. So far, 7 played, 7 lost. So it's not. He hasn't sort of stuck to the same constituency the whole time through, because he really wants to represent a particular patch of the Britain he loves. He's just gone from constituency to constituency looking for one he might win. So no, I think it's just unreasonable to expect him to be anything other than that. He is very Trumpoid in many ways, and it's extraordinary how Trump could behave in ways which would be offensive in any other politician. His supporters simply lap it up and say, oh, wonderful, and cheer all the louder. I don't think he needs to worry about that. My worry about him is quite different. My worry about him is that an awful lot of people are going to vote for him, or rather for his party, in a sort of trance. And they will then discover that what they've done is that they haven't got Nigel Farage in any position of prominence. They've got Keir Starmer in Downing Street, which wasn't what they meant at all. But there is this kind of swoon passing through various parts of conservative patriotic Britain at the moment, in which people are reduced to behaving extremely irrationally. I fight against it all the time, because I think, as in 1997, when I could do nothing about it at all, the real issues of this election are far, far vaster than the ones being contained in the launches and in the manifestos and in the broadcasts and the debates. And we really are on the edge of a major change in the way in which the country is governed and the sort of country it is, which isn't being discussed at all. And
How
it's quite
so,
likely.
Peter? Just without talking at too great a length, if that's okay. Just sort of bullet point for me. How are we on the precipice of an unprecedented change?
The principal thing is that we have once again a seriously dogmatic Labour Party and a very seriously dogmatic leader with a good chance of becoming Prime Minister. This hasn't happened before since Alistair Campbell became Prime Minister with Blair as his glove puppet in 1997. And this was a huge, colossal change in the way the country was governed, and it was followed immediately by several loud blows and bangs, as enormous things were done. Bank of England independence, Campbell appointed to give orders to civil servants without responsibility to Parliament, the huge raid on pensions, and then the rest followed, and the breakup of the United Kingdom, the beginnings of major constitutional reform, and an enormous cultural and sexual revolution from which we still haven't even begun to recover because most of us barely understood it. You hear it all ears, and that was 1997, which was presented as, oh, what a nice public school boy that Tony Blair is. Isn't it going to be nice to have him as Prime Minister instead of John Major? The trivial nature of that 97 election, if you look back on it, compared with the gigantic nature of the consequences, is still astonishing. I think we're in the same position here. Starmer is deeply ideological. I wrote last week in the Daily Mail about the extraordinary document which Gordon Brown has prepared for enormous constitutional change, which is very likely if Starmer comes into office. I've no doubt he has his own equivalent of Gordon Brown's raid on pension schemes from the 1990s, which did so much to change the way the country, well, actually removed wealth from one part of the country and gave it to another. And I think we must also recognize the great unexamined truth about Keir Starmer, which is that he is a powerfully ideologically driven politician. He really does believe in things. And this will mean he will be a different kind of prime minister from everybody, really, since Gordon Brown left office in 2010.
Matthew?
There's a lot to come back on that. First of all, there are those, of course, who would attack Starmer for not believing in things, for being pragmatic, for doing whatever it takes to become prime minister. Just on the reform point that Peter makes, I think he's taking a lot of these voters to be stupid. I think a lot of these voters, or if not all of them, realise perfectly well, as Farage himself has spelt out to them, if they weren't aware of it, that of course they're not voting for Farage to be prime minister. They're voting knowing, and Farage knows, that it's going to do serious damage to this Conservative Party. It could even be some sort of wipeout event. Let's wait and see. Take polls with a pinch of salt. They're doing it because, like so many people also on the left, we're just fed up with 14 years of Conservative failure, as I would argue it has been. Think of the cost of living. Think of the 7.5 million on the NHS waiting list. Think of sewage in our rivers, in our seas. I mean, I could go on. Think of GP appointments, dental care, and so on and so forth. Think of the armed forces. But moving on from that, I think it is important, given that Farage could win 6 million votes for reform, just to have a look very briefly at some of the things he's actually saying. He wants to run this country's immigration system like a nightclub, one in, one out over the course of 5 years. His manifesto, although he doesn't call it that, is based on essentially climate crisis denialism, this sort of weird obsessional opposition to net zero.
Yeah, he wants to scrap all existing carbon emissions
and
targets.
also on the sums, Kate, this is really important. The IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, they say even with the extremely optimistic assumptions that reform make about how much economic growth would increase, the sums in this manifesto do not add up.
Do they need to add up, Peter? Just very, very briefly, do these sums need to add up? Is that the point of it?
Of course they don't. The manifestos of the small parties are just playtime. There's the Green manifesto is the same. And in the slightest, no one's taking it seriously. The IFS and the ORB and all the fact checkers can gather around it in swarms if they want to. They're not taking any notice because they're not going to be the government. They can say what they like, and again, it doesn't really matter. On the point about that Matthew made about the readiness of Keir Starmer to swing about on superficial subjects, I agree. He's more of a whirligig than a weathercock. But these are things about which he doesn't really have any particularly strong views anyway. My contention is that he has powerful, strong views about the nature of society as a whole, which he's never been really asked about, and which will drive and guide his government. They don't change.
As a self-confessed socialist.
Well, I don't know about confessed. He's very proud of it, I think.
Yeah, he certainly is. All right, listen, I'm Matthew Stadlin. Is tactical voting fair game?
It's perfectly fair game. I don't think the parties should indulge in it. And as far as I'm aware, they aren't. But from a voter's perspective, of course, we're entitled to do exactly as we wish with our vote. And we're entitled to consult various websites to try to help us understand how it is we can achieve what we want. And if our main aim is to end 14 years of Tory rule, then we might want to vote Lib Dem instead of Labour, just for example. And if these Best for Britain guys' analysis is to be believed, then with tactical voting properly implemented, I mean, we could see it unseating Penny Mordaunt. I mean, the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, Robert Jenrick, Grant Shapps, James Cleverly, even Liz Truss's majority could be under threat. In fact, I was out on the doorsteps this morning helping a friend who is canvassing for Labour. And we were both talking to someone who isn't going to vote in this constituency, but is going to vote where she's also entitled to vote. Obviously, you can only vote once in Liz Truss's constituency because she thinks there's a chance of unseating her. So for the Tories, tactical voting is a total nightmare. And as we've been discussing in the first half of this half hour, it's really, really difficult for the Conservatives on the other side. Whichever way you look, the left are going to vote tactically, and on the right, people, as Peter fears, are going to hemorrhage the Conservative vote by voting reform in large numbers.
Well, this new polling from Survation shows that 15% of voters say they're still undecided, Peter Hitchens. And of those, the majority, so plenty of those are 2019 Tory voters. It was thought that they might lean again to Tory. They'd get to the point where they're undecided to the extent that they'll just go for the same again. Yet the analysis by Survation shows that when pressed, those voters are breaking for Labour. So of those, of this poll sample, just under 3,000 people, 22% of the undecideds say they would go for Labour. 14% say that they'll go for the Conservatives. So something just to note there. I just wonder what your attitude to tactical voting is. I'm curious.
Well, voting is just a practical act with measurable consequences, so it would always make sense to look into ways of making sure your vote was most effective in getting what you wanted. Though in my case, I no longer vote for anybody. I wouldn't dream of voting for any of the existing political parties. But it's sometimes very important to vote against. I mean, I, for instance, think it's vitally important for any person of intelligence to vote against Labour at the coming election. So if there was a good tactical reason to prevent a Labour MP from being elected to vote for another party than the Conservatives, who I don't like anyway, wouldn't cause me any trouble. I think the problem is actually that Conservative-minded or anti-Labour voters are less inclined to vote tactically than left-wing voters who've been exploring the idea for many years anyway, and who don't actually have all that much difference between their parties. So I think it works to the disadvantage of Conservative Britain when it happens, but that's largely because people take voting too much as a sacrament and too little as a political act. And if you take it as a sacrament, you're also inclined to suffer from emotional spasms in the polling booth and to vote because you want to punish some political party. A ludicrous ambition, because you won't if you kick out Conservative MP. All he's going to do is go off and spend more time with his money. He's not going to worry. It's not like spanking him on the bottom. And the only person you'll punish is yourself, because you then find you've got a Labour government which doesn't like you and doesn't pay any attention to you, and won't for years and years to come. But getting this across, I have to say, is a struggle in modern Britain.
Are you going to let that go? Are you going to let that go unchallenged, Kate?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that, Matthew.
I was just asking Kate whether she was going to let that go unchallenged. The idea that
I was going to throw to you on this, actually, Matthew. I think you're more than capable of challenging, and we're obviously here to hear your opinions rather than mine.
I just think it's a fantastic suggestion on Peter's part to wipe out, to erase a whole swathe of Labour MPs and say that they're not interested in people's futures, in people's well-being. It's utter nonsense. Peter, you're totally, or not totally...
I didn't say that, though. So it wouldn't indeed be nonsense if I had said it, but I didn't say any such thing. Is there something wrong with your loudspeaker?
Very possibly, if you didn't say it.
Well, that may be it, then.
By the way, just to stand up for some
something you've made up on the basis of what you thought I said.
Clarify for us, Peter. Peter, clarify for us so that we can set the record straight.
I can't clarify. I was perfectly clear the first time round. If Matthew's got it round the wrong end, I can't really help him. But I didn't say that, the thing that he attributed to me.
Just to stand up for something
about Labour MPs, actually.
But I think, and I think it's important to remember this when things are as partisan and party political as they are at the moment. I hope and think that most MPs of all persuasions go into Parliament, give up as much as they give up of their daily lives, their private lives, and so forth, in order to try and make the world a better place according to their political philosophy. And I can tell you this: that a lot of those Tory MPs in the red wall seats that stand to lose their seats, I suspect, are absolutely horrified at the prospect of doing so. And there is a phrase that is there's nothing so X as an ex-MP. So to suggest that Tory MPs are just going to go off and make loads of money, that might be true of Boris Johnson. I think it's unfair. And I say this as someone on the left. I think it's unfair to say that of Tory MPs. Peter is, I think, massively out of touch with the general population on most things. I mean, for example, Peter, I'm not sure, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not sure if you believe in gay marriage.
I am enormously out of touch. You're absolutely right.
I'm glad we've established that.
You did say that Labour don't care about us, Peter. I mean, it does feel like a broad brushstroke for none of this matters. It doesn't matter who's in charge. That you're disillusioned regardless. And I know that we've had these conversations before, but then that does then, slightly undermine all those people who are trying to make a difference, who do want to use their vote, whether it's tactically or not.
Excuse me, just a moment. I have to get something straight. What I said was, if there's a Labour government, it won't care about Conservative voters, and it won't.
I jolly well hope it will.
It's normal in these circumstances. It doesn't have to care about them.
How do they know which are Conservative voters?
But also, I think you're wrong, Peter. I think if Keir Starmer becomes Prime Minister, he has an absolute responsibility to care about Tory voters, not just for personal interest, not just for trying to win a second term if he's lucky enough to be in that position, but because he should be a Prime Minister for the whole country. America can be quite good at that. I mean, it's even more divided than it has been at the moment. But when a president becomes president, in certain circumstances at least, Americans do tend to rally around their president. I agree with the Trumpification of American politics. That's perhaps diminished a bit. But certainly as a left-leaning journalist, if Labour win a majority, and maybe even more particularly if they win a big majority, I'm not convinced they will, I will certainly be one amongst many, I hope, who will be holding a Labour government to account. For his part, I hope Starmer will be ruling for the whole country and not just for Labour voters.
And of course, the Conservatives will argue, as they have been arguing, as Grant Shapps argued again today, that it is their responsibility to form as big an opposition as possible so that they can also hold Labour to account. I'm going to have to leave it there for time, but I want to thank both of you for joining us. Some interesting food for thought there. Peter Hitchens, the Mail on Sunday columnist, and the political commentator Matthew Stadlen. Thanks for being with us here on the evening edition.